So welcome everyone. My name is Catalina Camilla. I'm the Free Press Managing Director here at the Freedom Forum. I'm joined by my colleagues, Michelle Billman and Nicole Thompson. Nicole will be helping me with slides and sharing resources. In a minute, I'll introduce our guest, Sarah Luderman from the 19th News, but I want to go over some rules of this webinar. We are recording so that we send the video to you and all the registrants of this webinar when we're done. We'll also be asking you from time to time to share in the chat. And again, the button is in the bottom center of your screen. Please make sure that your settings are set so that everyone sees your comments and your great suggestions. Next slide, please. This is the PowerShift project, and I want to tell you a little bit about what we do and the content that you're about to hear. The content was created by Jill Geisler, who is the Bill Plant Chair in Leadership and Media Integrity at Loyola University Chicago. Jill is a noted expert on leadership and management in the news media, and she draws on her experience as a TV news director. She created these materials in consultation with my colleague, Kathy Trost, who is Chief Engagement Officer here at the Freedom Forum. Kathy is a former reporter and editor who specialized in labor and employment coverage while at the Wall Street Journal. The PowerShift project was created in 2018 in response to the Me Too scandals that were rocking the media at the time. We are committed to the principle that harassment and discrimination are both inseparable and intersectional. And everything that we do in these webinars and in our trainings are aimed at helping you create media workplaces free of harassment, discrimination, and incivility. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce our guest, Sarah Luderman from the 19th News. Nicole, if you could turn on Sarah's camera. We're about to have a conversation. Hi, Sarah, good to see you. We are very fortunate to have a guest speaker who can help underscore some of the principles of inclusive leadership that we are trying to teach today, specifically the importance of identifying and including the missing in our workplaces and in the journalism that we do. Sarah is a reporter for the 19th News, an independent, nonpartisan news outlet that's devoted to coverage of women and the LGBTQ+ community. Sarah is also among the few prominent journalists that we know of who works with a disability. She is on the autism spectrum. Sarah, welcome. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started writing about disability issues?
Hi, Catalina. Thanks for having me. So I have a little bit of a non-traditional background. I didn't know I wanted to be a journalist until I was probably in my mid-20s. I didn't go to journalism school. I actually started working out in the intellectual and developmental disability nonprofit space. And then 2016 and 2017 happened. And I think that was sort of a very volatile and life-changing time for a lot of people. And for me, I think that the moment where I realized I wanted to be a journalist was when I think you probably remember sort of these very dramatic images of folks being arrested in their wheelchairs outside of then Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's office. And sort of there's a lot of reporting on that. And I remember seeing those images and reading the reporting, and I know some of those people from my community, and I felt like the way that it was being reported on sort of was like missing a lot of the big picture history and like the reasons for why folks were doing it. So I thought, oh well, I could give it a shot. Maybe I'll try writing this myself.
Well, you've been doing a great job. So thank you for all that you do. I wanted to highlight something that you did write about in the Neiman reports. And that's the article we showed on the title page. And Nicole will share it in the chat now. We'll also include it in the resources that we give to all webinar participants. But in that Neiman Reports article, I was struck by something that you wrote, which is that people who are well-versed in equity and inclusion sometimes seem to forget that disabled people even exist. What did you mean by that? What prompted you to say that? And what are some of the things that well-meaning people can do to include you in the conversation in the newsroom and include you and your community in the coverage?
Yeah, so I think that a big trap that a lot of people fall into, even people that I think are relatively well informed about diversity and inclusion, is the idea that like disability isn't an identity, it's a bad thing that happens to a person. Whereas like I actually have multiple disabilities. I'm also partially blind on top of having of being autistic, and like those are parts of who I am, like as much as being, you know, as much as whatever my sexual orientation, as much as my gender, as much as my race, like disability is a part of me. It's not like a bad thing that happened to me, it just is. And I think that that's something that a lot of folks miss. Like they think that it's something, yeah, something something to pity. And I think that that's like a real mistake that people make even when they're well-meaning. So I think that people really need to think about disability in terms of identity in a way that they haven't previously.
You know, you make a really good point, because many journalists of color and many people of color often say that they are recognized in coverage or in the workplace as being either worsts or firsts. And how we actually accept the true authenticity of someone is very important when improving workplace cultures. I want to go back a little bit and talk about how your experiences helped inform some of your coverage. And you wrote a great blockbuster scoop a couple of years ago when then Congressman Madison Cawthorn, you caught him in a lie. And for our webinar participants who don't know anything about the congressman, he was paralyzed after an accident, and that requires him to use a wheelchair. But he was boasting about training for the Paralympics. And Sarah wrote a story for The Nation, which unfortunately we can't share because it's password protected. But tell us about the story that you wrote and how your experiences helped you go deeper on the reporting.
Yeah, so I would say that's probably the story that made my career. And it was also, so at that point, I had been writing for a couple of years, and I'd mostly done sort of like cultural commentary pieces. I was freelancing, and I pitched this story to The Nation that was more of like a culture commentary piece about Madison Cawthorn, because he's, you know, he uses a wheelchair, he's prominent, he had been elected pretty recently. And there was a lot of reporting about sort of some of the wilder stuff he was saying and doing. And so I didn't go into it thinking that I was going to find what I was going to find. So I started looking into sort of like how he identified with his disability and how he talked about it. And I found some older interviews, one of which was with, I think, Jewish Insider and a couple other publications, where he had said he had been training for the Paralympics. So I thought, oh, okay, that's really interesting. I'm going to dig into that because the Paralympic community is like very tight knit. Those are elite athletes. They all tend to know each other. So I started asking around, and it turned out that he had not been training for the Paralympics in any meaningful way. He had been, I mean, like anybody can say they're training. I could say I'm training for the Olympics, you know, like it doesn't mean anything. Like he hadn't been doing the qualifiers, he hadn't been doing like the sort of elite athletic stuff that's involved. And he had also been making all these really weird Instagram posts, like claiming he was doing it, like claiming that he was training for such and such race, even though it wasn't a qualifier. Like, and so when I started digging, like I just kept finding all this weird stuff. And I remember sending my editor at the time, Christopher Shea, like I sent him this email and I'm like, I think he's lying about being a Paralympian, which is like, it's a weird thing to lie about. And the thing is, like at that point, people had been going over him with a fine-tooth comb. Like they had found Instagram posts where he talked about visiting Hitler's vacation home. Like they talked about things he had said that were questionable, but like no one had really dug into this aspect. And I think that a lot of people just assumed like, oh, he's, you know, he's pretty fit and he's in a wheelchair, so of course he was training for the Paralympics. Like I think people just didn't think to dig, or maybe they felt uncomfortable. And I don't feel uncomfortable because I have a disability. Like I'm not worried about someone calling me out for being insensitive. And also like I was able to see these irregularities, like the initial surface ones, because I'm familiar with the community. And so I think that like the lack of disability in newsrooms, although that's been changing in recent years, has left a lot of organizations really ill-equipped to notice this kind of thing, because it wasn't hard for me to figure it out. Like I was freelancing at the time. I didn't have a ton of resources. I didn't have like, you know, a huge investigative team at my disposal or anything. Like, but because I was part of the community, I knew, and I was able to see something that other people missed.
That's an important lesson about bringing yourself and your experiences into the observations that you make as a journalist. Sarah, you've been great with your time. I think we have time for one more question, and it's something that I wanted to frame in the right way. So if I don't, I apologize. But can you tell us something about that absolutely drives you crazy when a source or a colleague learns that you're autistic? Are there some do's and don'ts that we all should learn about what you go through, how we should work and interact with you?
Yeah, I will say with sources, I actually think that it's a major benefit, which I think people wouldn't expect, because autism does have like sort of some social linguistic challenges inherent in it. Like, but I think that like the fact that I have a disability, I think a lot of people feel more comfortable talking to me. Like I write about caregiving, and so I think a lot of people feel more comfortable talking to me because on some level, I get it. Like I understand what living with a disability is like. Obviously, it's different for everyone, but I think that it builds a lot of empathy, and actually like makes a lot of people more comfortable talking to me. Conversely, I will say that it has been less of a benefit in the newsroom in a lot of ways. I think that the thing that sort of drives me crazy is like, and I think this is something a lot of journalists of color experience as well. And I feel like I've learned a lot from journalists of color about this topic, and how to deal with it, is that like there's sort of this idea that because I'm part of this community and I have this identity, that I am too biased to report on these issues, that I'm an activist in some way. And it's very frustrating. And so I think that like assuming that someone can't report on their own community issues because of their identity is really offensive, and it's something that happens with disability as well. So I would say that's like the thing that really drives me crazy that comes up. It doesn't come up at the 19th, which is good. Like, I mean, I think that it's a place where I can bring my whole self to work, but it's definitely come up in the past.
Well, there's a part in the webinar where I'll talk about why publications like the 19th exist and why they have been such a great addition to journalism and to our understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sarah, we're out of time for this segment. You're welcome to stay with us for the webinar, but I do want to share with the class a couple of things that might help you think more deeply about disability issues. One, the Washington Post last month developed a helpful guide in determining whether you are an ableist. And ableism is when even well-meaning people show signs of unconscious bias against people with disabilities. And Nicole will share that in the chat. And again, it's available in the resource guide. Sarah also shared with us a couple of very important resources that will help journalists in covering and understanding disability issues. And Nicole will share that in the chat as well. And again, they will be available to you. Sarah, I want to thank you again for being with us, for sharing your story and your journey. And thank you for being a friend and ally of the Power Shift Project. I'm going to go on now back to the classroom portion of this webinar. And Nicole, whenever you're ready, if you can put the slide deck back up on the screen. Thank you. So let's begin with a discussion of defining who is an inclusive leader. Inclusive leaders advance the sense of belonging among all staff members, especially those who have traditionally been excluded or underrepresented. Next slide. So who can be an exclusive leader? There are two words I'd like to emphasize. Because the definition really is anyone with power or influence. Your expertise on a beat or a subject area can give you influence. Your tenure may give you influence, or even just the trust that people have in you gives you influence. Power can be conferred through title, such as editor or team leader. But title alone doesn't make you an inclusive leader. It's really about your actions. And here are the 8 things that we know inclusive leaders do. They learn and grow. They speak and show their values. They identify and include the missing. They give oxygen to authenticity. They scrutinize systems and break barriers. They light the path to success. They deliver meaningful feedback and coaching. And they share power, information, and credit. And we'll refer to this list very often throughout this webinar. And again, we'll share it with you at the end. So let's talk about how you learn and grow. Next slide, please. This section is aimed at helping you understand inequity in your profession, both past and present. What more do you need to know, and how do you gain that knowledge? Next slide. The Pew Research Center has for several years taken a deep dive at the state of the news industry. And for several years, the numbers have looked bleak when it comes to understanding about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. In the 2022 survey, Pew found that fewer than half of the journalists surveyed say their organization places a great deal of focus on diversity and inclusion. 42% indicate it's a major priority for their organization. Another 30% say, however, it's a minor priority, and 16% say it's not a priority at all. Keep in mind that this survey was done 2 years after the murder of George Floyd, which led to a reawakening across the country about race relations. Next slide. You'll see here the disparity in attitudes by people of color and younger journalists. They say they're more likely to take trainings about diversity and to discuss the issue in their organizations. These numbers clearly show that we have more work to do. But if you don't have access to trainings like this webinar, or have a newsroom where trainings are made available to you, or even have colleagues who include you in discussions about diversity and inclusion, what can you do? Next slide. You, of course, just like any good journalist, you want to find helpful resources. And here's an array of some of the ones that we have used in the past that I have found helpful. In the center of your screen, there is reference to the National Center on Disability and Journalism, which is part of the Cronkite School at ASU. They have lots of resources that are very, very helpful. Disability Matters, the toolkit, is one of the ones that Sarah recommends, and we've included that in the chat and in the resource kit. I'd also encourage you all to read up on various sources from Neiman Labs and elsewhere. Many of the journalism of color organizations, many of the journalism affinity organizations like JAWS and the Trans Journalists Association also have helpful resources for you as well. Next slide. There are several newsletters that you can subscribe to. One popular one that has been around for a long time is by Richard Prince, who is a former reporter at the Washington Post. He writes journalisms. I like reading something that we referred to in the previous slide called Sincerely Leaders of Color by my friend Emma Carew Grovum and Kim Bowie. There are lots of avenues for you to pursue here. Next slide, please. So in terms of learning and growing, let's go back to something that Sarah brought up, and that's about empathy. Empathy is a key skill of inclusive leaders, but do you understand how to lead with empathy? Next slide. This is what Jamil Zaki, a psychologist who has written a book called The War for Kindness, has to say about empathy. And there are three kinds of empathy, he writes. There's cognitive empathy, which means you can sense the feelings of others. Think about whether you can read a room or read a situation really well. That's cognitive empathy. Emotional empathy is when you can feel the feelings of others. And then finally, empathic concern. Zaki says that is not just sensing or feeling emotions, but being moved to do something about it. And we find, excuse me, in his research and in our own practices, employees who view their workplace as empathic are more committed and less stressed. Empathic teams collaborate much more effectively because empathic individuals are more likely to help colleagues and less likely to act unethically. They are seen as natural leaders, and their team members tend to be satisfied with their work and motivated rather than discouraged by the feedback. Next slide, please. Again, in terms of resources and reading, a couple of things. I found the New York Times series last year, How to Be More Empathetic, very, very helpful in my own journey. Our friend Jill Geisler wrote a column for the National Press Club Journalism Institute about how empathy and accountability aren't incompatible. and she gives 5 management tips. One of the things that Jill writes about is something called emotional intelligence. It's what helps you choose your words carefully because you think through how your words might help others. Next slide, please. Back to our list of the 8 things inclusive leaders do. Number 2 is they speak and show their values. Inclusive leaders feel as though their actions speak louder than words. And sometimes they don't just talk about it, but they actually share it in very visible ways. This is a picture and some tweets by my friend Paul Chung. Paul is now the CEO of the Center for Public Integrity. Many of you may know him through his previous work at the Miami Herald and the AP and the Knight Foundation. But Paul is well known for his deep commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when he took over at CPI, which is a well-known center for investigative journalism, previously run mostly by people who are not people of color, he set about to change both the face and the culture of the organization. Today, people of color and women make up more than half of the staff at CPI, and their journalism is exclusively about inequity and the underserved. Paul posts on Twitter a lot. He speaks on a lot of panels, and he's very transparent about what his values are and how they affect him as a leader and affect his organization. When his appointment was announced, he also said that as an immigrant, he understands and experiences the pitfalls and promises of America. Again, he's an example of someone who speaks and shows their values. Next slide. Now it's your turn. If you can share in the chat, in the Zoom chat, what are some of your values and how do you demonstrate them? Let's take a couple of minutes, and if folks want to add things in the chat about how you speak and show your values, I'd like to share that with the whole class. Anyone? I'll share one for my own background in working in newsrooms. I always like to make sure that people understand why I make certain assignments and why I might suggest to some people who are quieter or maybe not have had opportunities to take the lead. Stephanie says that empathy and listening are big for her. Fietta says she shares her values often with both vulnerability and care. Monique says being present and listening versus talking over people or trying to get a view. I saw someone else say that they practice active listening, and those are really great tips. Next slide, please. Number 3 on our list is something that we've talked about already this morning, and that is inclusive leaders identify and include the missing. I was super excited when Sarah immediately responded to my email request to join in this seminar, because I thought she would add a great dimension about a topic that I don't think a lot of us talk about when we talk about diversity and inclusion. So what do we mean by identify and include the missing. Think about what happens in your organizations and look to see where someone has been left out, or maybe you haven't even give full consideration. Are you missing people when you make staffing decisions or when staffing decisions are made? Are there people missing when there's an opportunity for an assignment that would boost someone's career? Are you missing something when you socialize as an organization, or when you frame stories, or in the story sources that you approach? Next slide, please. Here's an example of some research about who is missing in the media workforce. A GAO report in September 2022 shows very clearly that we have a lot to do to catch up with the changing demographics in America, particularly when it comes to Latinos. Hispanic workers comprised an estimated 12% of the media industry's workforce, according to this GAO report. But outside of the media, however, Hispanics are an estimated 18% of all workers. And here's an example of how PBS NewsHour handled the story about this GAO report. Next slide. Sarah was great in helping us talk about organizations like the 19th News that have been created specifically to highlight certain communities and topics. Here's a screenshot from Capital B, a publication that was founded a year ago by Black journalists who believe that local and national news organizations are lacking in their coverage of Black communities. I think it's great that there is this entrepreneurial spirit in the media right now, and there are innovative ways that journalists are finding to fill the voids in coverage, whether it's the 19th News or Capital B. Feel free to share some other sources in the chat. I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. If you want to invest in some tools that will help you identify and include the missing, here's a couple of great resources. API has a tool called Source Matters that allows you to track the diversity of your sources. Santa Clara University has a journalism source diversity monitor. Amy is suggesting that we check out the Kansas City Defender. Next slide, please. The API source, I think, has a cost to it. If you can't invest in those tools, here's a great resource from NPR. NPR tracks diversity and shares the information of their diverse sources in one database. They also have a newsletter about their diverse sources, and you can search who they've interviewed by geography and expertise. And I really love the source of the week. They give you contact information. So if you're working on stories in these topics, you can call on these sources as well. Next slide, please. Next on our list of the 8 things that inclusive leaders do is something that you've heard me talk about already, and that is they give oxygen to authenticity. They allow people to be who they are. Next slide. Authenticity, as Sarah pointed out, encompasses lots of things: your life experiences, your values, your heritage, your sexual orientation, your race, ethnicity, your personality type, much, much more. I know that I bring to bear my experiences as an Asian American woman, as the eldest of 3 children, as someone who comes from San Francisco, as a first generation college graduate. These are all of the things that make up who I am and who have shaped me as a journalist. Next slide. In an authentic workplace, people feel the comfort of being their true selves. And I'd like to share with you one example that I find particularly inspiring. Next slide. I'd like you to meet Aya Galal. Aya is a journalist at WFSB, a CBS network affiliate owned by Gray TV in Hartford, Connecticut. Aya grew up in Connecticut and went to college at Quinnipiac, where she was involved in the campus TV station. Connecticut is home to roughly 100,000 Muslims, and they represent about 1% of the adults who identify with one of the non-Christian faiths. In college, when Aya was starting out in the business, she told an interviewer that she was very careful to do journalism work only behind the scenes. She told the Connecticut Insider in an interview in 2021 that she feared that no TV station would hire her for her on-air job because of her hijab. Next slide. When she went to work at the TV station, she had the support of her colleagues and management, and she steadily began getting more experience in the field and opportunities to build her tape reel. And viewers of this station were able to get more comfortable with her on the news. And in 2021, she was given the opportunity to anchor the news at her station. And when she did, she became the first journalist in Connecticut to anchor the news while wearing a hijab. She told the Connecticut Insider that the response was mostly positive and that she was able to demystify a little bit about her religion by doing so. As she says, Muslims are part of this country, and growing up, there were not people who looked like me on television, she said. And she reported that she received so many messages from Muslim families happy to see a Muslim on air. Next slide. Another way, another example of giving oxygen to authenticity is something that I still think goes on today on TV. And that is the freedom and the support that Black women in TV news are feeling about wearing their hair naturally. These are images from a Pointer Institute story that took a deeper dive look on something that was trending in social media, and that's the hashtag natural hair on air. Autumn Robertson, the meteorologist from Florida, who's pictured here with her beautiful braids, said she got no pushback from management when she decided to wear her hair naturally, but it was readers who questioned her professionalism. And Autumn told Pointer, "What do you deem professional at the end of the day?" She said her hair doesn't take away from her expertise or the way she does her job or the knowledge that she brings in being a meteorologist. Again, she's being her authentic self. Next slide. a couple of things to think about. And again, if you'd like to share, please share in the chat. Have you ever had to check it at the door at work or been asked to do that? Have you had to change or withhold some aspect of yourself because it didn't feel safe or smart to do otherwise? Think about that and think about how you might approach things differently. Nicole, if we could go to the next slide. I think we're at the halfway point in our list of what inclusive leaders do. And before we move on to number 5, Michelle is sharing something about authenticity that I'd like to share with the class. She says that in previous work environments, she avoided discussing caregiving so she wouldn't be judged. Stephanie says the same thing. Parenting does come to mind. I know that in my previous work, as I sometimes was reluctant to discuss taking time off to care for my mother, who is being challenged with health issues. Amy shares that having to ask for religious holidays and hope that she could get them off when people of other faiths don't have to worry about that. Rebecca also understands the parenting issues. She says she never used to allude to her children because of adverse reactions she might receive from former managers. Thank you all for sharing ways in which you've had to hold back your authentic selves. I want to move on now to number 5 on our list, and it's an important one about scrutinizing systems and breaking barriers. Next slide. There are 2 ways I think that every news organization needs to think a little bit more thoughtfully and change the way they do things. One is in job descriptions and hiring criteria, because there is a strong possibility of systemic inclusion when this occurs. Think to yourself about the job descriptions in your organizations. Do you use gender neutral language? Words like expert, superior, world class, they all signal competition. And research has shown they're a turnoff to women. Here's an example of a web developer, Sebastian Ramirez, who says years of experience don't necessarily translate to skill. And he talks about reading a job description in which 4+ years of experience is required in this tool called Fast API. Well, he helped develop that tool, and he only has 1.5 years of experience on it. So when he sees a job description saying, well, you need 4+ years on Fast API, he says, maybe it's time to reevaluate that years of experience is the same as skill level. Next slide, please. Here's some interesting guidance from Lauren Rivera, who teaches at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. She studied people doing job interviews with candidates, and here's what she found. Usually when interviewers said they clicked or had chemistry with a candidate, they often meant that they shared a similar background. Perhaps they played the same sports, went to the same grad school, or regularly vacationed in the same spot. Then interviewers would interpret that interpersonal comfort as an indicator that the candidate would be a good fit for their firm or organization. Here's the lesson from Rivera's research. Obviously, don't hire a mini-me. But the research also shows that instead of hiring for cultural fit, it might be better to hire for a cultural add or cultural contributions. Ask yourself, what can a candidate bring to the table to this org that's fresh or new or different? Instead of asking questions in interviews about how would you fit in our team, perhaps the question to ask is, what can you teach us and what can we learn from you? Next slide. Another process in newsrooms to scrutinize is how you evaluate and assess performance. There was a lot of blowback last year when the union representing the New York Times newsroom staff reported that Black and Latino staffers were less likely than their white peers to get strong job ratings. I'd be curious to see how the New York Times' evaluation process has changed since these stories like the one here at NPR broke. But again, evaluation processes need to be looked at through the lens of whether they're fair and inclusive. Next slide, please. Number 6 on our list is tied very closely to number 5, and that is that inclusive leaders light the path to success. And what do we mean by that? Are there secrets, for instance, to getting opportunities on your watch? Next slide. We hear all the time that managers often think that they're being transparent because they say something in a meeting or because a job posting is there on your career site, or because people just know that there might be an opportunity because someone else left the organization. But we know that inclusive leaders take a more active approach to lighting the path to success. Next slide. I think it's important to stop and think for a second how bias affects how people evaluate and are evaluated for quote, potential. Here's some research done at Yale that found that women aren't promoted because managers underestimate their potential. Specifically, the researchers found that while women receive higher performance ratings, they're less likely to get promoted because their potential ratings are lower. The authors estimate that the lower potential ratings explain this big gap in promotions. And just like we all shared in the chat earlier, do you say to yourself, or do you find yourself saying about people in your news organization, this person has kids, so they wouldn't want this assignment? Or do you say, this person is so quiet, they wouldn't do well in this kind of assignment? That's the way that potential is being overlooked or undervalued. Next slide. So when thinking about how you light a path to success, think about how you communicate career advancing opportunities, how you communicate how and why you select people for assignments, and how well you debrief people after such assignments. Next slide, please. We're at number 7 on our list, And we know that inclusive leaders deliver meaningful feedback and coaching. Next slide. I want to point out something that Jill talks about a lot in her presentations about adopting a progress bar mindset for your team members. Now, we've all done online surveys where they show you your progress based on the number of questions that you have answered. Jill has some great tips here about a progress bar mindset when giving feedback. And one of the things that I think is really important, both for you as an employee and for those who might be managers, is to recognize that you love people enough to let them go. And what do we mean by that? That's when you recognize that you've done all you can to advance someone and their success. Yes, recruiting and retention are very important to this business, but there are many factors that work against you in keeping someone happy and inspired. Good managers know that when they need to say goodbye to someone for the good of their own development. Next slide, please. Inclusive leaders also share power, information, and credit. Again, it's a good time to take stock of things that we've talked about, and really the overarching theme of this webinar, which is that inclusive leaders advance the success and sense of belonging among all staff members, especially those who have traditionally been excluded or underrepresented. In the next slide, I'd like you to meet our friend, Francisco Vara Orta. Some of you may know Francisco, who is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors. Francisco is someone who very loudly and often shares in the credit with others. He helped create this DBEI symposium last year that was a way for journalists across the country to take part in IRE training when they couldn't travel. He and IRE help participants look at data and investigative reporting techniques through the prism and the lens of diversity. Francisco likes to share credit, as he does here, with the people who help him, and he does it often in social media, and says that the reason why he does that is that the benefits of sharing credit are many, chiefly helping people feel more of their dignity in being validated and cherished because of their contributions to our field and to their environments. But he also says there's a boomerang effect to sharing credit and sharing it often, because when you do so, you are also likely to be told or shown how valued your contributions are to the relationships around you. Next slide. So think about where your opportunities are to put into practice the 8 things that we've learned about what inclusive leaders do. We've come to the end of the webinar, and I'm going to real quickly go through some overarching lessons. Nicole, if you could help me with the next slide, please. Inclusive leaders know that diversity is the start. It opens doors. Inclusion happens when people feel they belong. People in your organizations determine when they belong, but you as the inclusive leader, make it happen. And then we know that leadership turns commitment into culture. And we're talking about good culture, a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Next slide. I've mentioned several times that we have lots of resources for you. If you have your phones ready, here's a QR code, but don't worry, we always do a follow-up email. There's this tips list that Jill put together, the 8 things that inclusive leaders do. We also put together the resources that went into building this webinar and the teachings, and also include some other resources that we've referenced in the slide deck and that Sarah shared with us as well. Next slide. As I mentioned to all of you, the Power Shift project here at the Freedom Forum has 3 components. One large component is helping you train others in your newsroom. The Workplace Integrity Training Workshop is a 2-day, 2.5-hour course. And I've seen in today's participants, many of you have already taken part or have already registered for the next Train the Trainers workshop. Our friend Amy Simons at the Missouri School of Journalism will be leading the next session. We've already got some 55 journalists eager and ready and registered for the May 16th and 17th event. The QR code is there, or you can find the registration on the powershiftproject.org website. Next slide. The second webinar in the PowerShift project is the Do You Qualify as an Ally webinar. And Francisco Vara Orta, also a member of our Trainers Council, will be leading that session. His first session was a terrific blend of conversation and classroom teaching and drawing on experiences from newsroom. So I encourage you to take part in that. It's on June 12th at 1 o'clock. And then finally on the next slide, if there's ever anything that we can help you with in creating positive change in your organizations, please reach out to one of us on the PowerShift project team. Our emails are listed here. I want to thank you all for taking the time and joining us today. I think your contributions have been terrific in the chat. I enjoy leading this discussion, and I hope that you all got a lot out of the discussion with Sarah Luderman, and I hope that you read some of her work on the 19th News. I wish you all well as you seek to create workplaces that are free of harassment, incivility, and discrimination. So thank you all, and have a nice day.